Hey everyone, welcome back to the balancing act. I do it every time.
Oh, we're back at this.
I do this every time for you.
Back at this. Why are we? They can see it.
I know they can see it, but do you know why I do? Do you know part of it is because I don't know if, well, I know you've noticed it, but we've actually set up the banner differently. There's no more bulldog clips. Look, Andrew's done a great job.
Yeah, fantastic.
Hey?
So well done, Andrew.
Well done, Andrew. I'm so proud of you, man. No, thanks very much. Hey, mate. We got a really interesting guy this morning, Dr. Simon Kennedy.
Yeah, I'm actually very excited. I think, as I think about it, this is something that during my theological studies I've been wrestling with and playing around with and trying to understand, coming from South Africa, being in an African context, and just the importation of Western theological ideals and how the Africans should engage with that. All of these different things were things that fascinated me during my own studies. And so I'm super keen to dive into what that looks like in an Australian context and how we can wrestle with this thing of worldview, man. It's so good.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you finally got there because you went on a diatribe and actually didn't talk about what we're actually going to be talking about, which is worldview.
Okay.
But no, it's good, mate. I'm really good.
Maybe you should introduce
I should.
and then we can carry on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, today we've got Dr. Simon Kennedy joining us. Simon is a historian specialising primarily in the history of legal, political and religious ideas. That's impressive just in and of itself, right? Like, seriously. But Simon is a senior research fellow at the University of Queensland and is actually a non-resident fellow at the Danube Institute in Budapest, which is very exotic. That is very cool. Simon has written a couple of books, and in particular, the second book that we are very much interested in and engaging with, which is a book called Against Worldview. And it will come up here and now and with a bit of a link. So that you can go and purchase this book and have a bit of a think about worldview and the likes. But Simon is also married to Hayley and they've got 5 kids, which is crazy.
I don't know how he does it.
Well, I don't know how he does it because he's like
That's amazing.
Like really young, man. Like
and really busy.
Really busy. That's awesome.
Amazing.
But more than that, Simon is a passionate follower of Jesus. He is a child of God and has a real passion for helping us all as believers engage well in the world around us for the glory of Jesus. And so, Simon, good to have you, mate.
Welcome,
thanks for joining us on The Balancing Act.
Thanks, guys. It's great to be here with you both. Looking forward to the chat.
Yeah. Mate, crazy. You're like, just before we jump into kind of the more stuff, what's your background? Like, where did you grow up? How did all of that operate?
Yeah, I grew up in Geelong, which is near Melbourne, and I was actually born over in Gippsland, which is where all the coal mines are being shut down at the moment, down in Victoria. But I grew up in Geelong, grew up in the evangelical part of the Anglican Church down there. So I grew up in a Bible-believing, gospel-preaching church, just a little church in the western part of Geelong. My parents still go to that church. It's a really good little church, and I'm really thankful for what God's done through His Spirit and through the preaching and the discipleship that I received there. But I've become a Presbyterian, and so I'm actually ordained as an elder in the Presbyterian Church now. Not as a teaching elder, so I'm not a minister or anything, but I do teach some seminaries and things like that around the place, and so that's where I've landed there. But yeah, grew up in Victoria. Now I live in Queensland, which is a lot better, if you ask me.
Why? Because they like NRL more in Queensland than they do in Victoria? Oh, no, I'm not
nothing to do with that.
I won't go there. Mate, you've written a really interesting book called Against Worldview. Why don't you kind of share with us just briefly the nature of the book, why you wrote it?
Sure. Yeah. So I wrote this book off the back of, I guess, two things mainly. One was I've always been interested in worldview thinking. So, I started reading people like Abraham Kuyper, a long time ago. And, as a Reformed Protestant Christian, worldview is a really common concept. So I'd been wrestling with, how thinking about how Christianity applies to all of life, thinking about how the gospel impacts all of life, and just wanting to understand how that works and how to think that through really well. And worldview seemed like a good concept to do that, and that's really common in people like Abraham Kuyper and really great thinkers like Francis Schaeffer and others as well. And more recently, people like Nancy Pearcey and plenty of other people use this concept.
Yeah.
However, when I was doing my doctoral studies and thinking about how to, integrate my faith with what I was doing in my studies, and then I started teaching in a Christian context. The way I was thinking about worldview wasn't quite working. I didn't feel like it was a good or useful concept in the way that I thought it was. So I thought I want to try and work this out because I think everyone does have a worldview. I think that's unavoidable. I think that the concept can still be useful, but it just wasn't really working for me in the lecture theatre and in classes and so on. When I was trying to apply a Christian worldview approach to everything I was teaching, it wasn't really working. So I thought I'm going to think this through. So I thought, okay, I'll write a book. And that's what happened. I wrote a book, and now it's out in the world.
That's awesome.
What do you like when we're talking about this idea of worldview? What is a worldview? What are you saying when you say worldview? For our listeners, maybe that are going, like when you mentioned Christian worldview, what exactly are you saying when you say that?
Yeah, sure. That's an important question because worldview can be defined in a number of different ways. The way I define it in the book is this. I say that a Christian worldview is a true apprehension of reality that is attained through the process of learning about God, the self, and the world. That's a quote from the book.
Yeah, okay.
And I'll let me unpack that a little bit. So I say a Christian worldview is a true apprehension of reality. What do I mean by that? Basically, what I mean is that you have a Christian worldview if you can look at or think about God, and look at and think about what He's made, and think about yourself in a way that is accurate or true and reflects how things really are. So that's a Christian worldview in the way that I define it.
So in a sense, it becomes a lens in which the way you see and engage in the world around you.
Yeah, that's often how people understand worldview. I have a problem with the kind of optical imagery that people often use with worldview, because I think we don't actually. I would query the usefulness of that. I think if we want to talk about kind of like having a lens through which we see the world, I mean, we can do that, and I think we do see the world through various lenses, but none of them are very neat.
Yeah.
None of them are very tidy or well put together. So we're really marred by sin. We're marred by ideas that come from all over the place.
Yeah,
Not every, as Christians, we don't think through things consistently.
Yeah.
So we can say we're Christians, and do we magically get a Christian worldview when we're Christians? If we go to Worldview boot camp, do we magically get a Christian worldview? I would say no. And so I think actually worldview functions more like one of the goals of Christian discipleship. So what we want to do is we want to help people get a Christian worldview. But I don't think we can necessarily put on worldview glasses and that, ta-da, everything, is understood properly through the lens of how God understands the world. So I guess I would hesitate to use the optical imagery of putting on glasses. Interestingly, though, John Calvin uses that imagery, but he talks about the scriptures as a pair of glasses that you put on to view general revelation. So he says the scriptures are special revelation from God, which help us to interpret general revelation properly. So this imagery is used in the Protestant tradition, and I think it's used really well, but I wouldn't use it necessarily in the context of thinking about worldview. So that's one of the things I'm questioning in the book, and I'm wanting to push back on a little bit.
Okay, so when you say you're against worldview, you're against a particular way worldview has been played out, or you're not really against worldview? What do you?
Yeah, no, this is a good question because the book is titled in a provocative way and it sells books, right? So the publisher chose
Yeah.
the publisher chose the title.
Yeah, but you got 5 kids to feed. You got
that's
5
it,
kids to
exactly.
feed. You got a family to take care of.
Yeah. No, I'm happy for it to sell well. That's fine with me. But that is a deliberately provocative title, and I am against a certain kind of worldview thinking.
Sure.
I'm not actually against worldview entirely. I think, we do have what I described as a sort of so even if we were to take someone else's definition of worldview, which you could say is a sort of precognitive, intuitive apprehension of the world, before we've even started thinking about and analysing all the parts of the world, we just think about it and understand it in a certain way, and we might say that's our worldview. That's what some people say worldview is. Yep, I believe that's true. We have that kind of interaction with the world around us and with ourselves and with God.
Like a presupposition of some sort?
Yeah, presuppositions. You could say it's connected to presuppositions and to presuppositional apologetics.
Yeah.
But I would, again, not necessarily think that that's a helpful way of thinking about worldview. So I am against that kind of worldview thinking, but I'm not against worldview per se. I think we do want to have a Christian worldview, but it's something that we work on across our whole lives as we grow in in our sanctification, as we renew our minds, as we grow in learning and in knowledge about God's world.
Yeah. Yeah, and so this becomes a big thing, right? And you just kind of hit out of that in a real sense, it becomes a process of discovery, right? So as Christians who have been born again by the Spirit, as we engage with the Scriptures, we're engaging and walking closely with Jesus, as we start to re-engage in a world in a different way, it becomes a process of discovery, right? And this is a big thing that you've been advocating for. Rather than it kind of dropping in and imposing it upon someone, it becomes a process of discovery. What does that discovery look like specifically for you?
Right. One of the things I was wanting to think about in the book was trying to combine a Christian worldview understanding of education with the realities of how we learn. So I was particularly interested in Christian education, but I think this can be applied to Christian formation generally. I think that, we grow as people. When we grow as people, we tend to grow bit by bit, right? So when we're learning to, we crawl before we walk, right? And we walk before we run. Now, of course, we see people walking and running when we're little and we're crawling, and we think that's what we want to do. You can see babies getting up and trying to walk and trying to emulate the people around them who can walk and run. It doesn't always go very well, but there is a sense in which there's an interaction between what we might call a kind of deductive approach to learning. So you could say, over there, that person's running, and I want to do that, but you can't yet. So you have to practice, or you have to grow in your knowledge of being able to walk and run. But the reality is, as we learn and as we grow as people and as Christians, we do so step by step and bit by bit and piece by piece. And so generally speaking, learning is an inductive process, which means that we gradually gather pieces of knowledge and information together, and then that helps us form different pieces of truth about the world around us. And we do this, generally speaking, this is gradual. Now, it's not to say that we don't start with big categories and we don't necessarily impose sort of higher level categories and higher level thinking upon reality around us as we think about it. I think we do that. And a good example of that is something like systematic theology, if you're interested in reading theology, or even something like doing a catechism. So, we teach our children the catechism as part of our discipleship of our kids. And we've been in churches where the catechism is taught in the church to the children. And the children don't necessarily understand everything that the catechism says, but it gives them a scaffolding for thinking about the world and thinking about God, right? And so that's more deductive. But I'm really interested in thinking about education as an inductive process. And I think we need to sort of rethink how we understand worldview in light of that. So this is how we kind of gradually grow, I think, as people and as Christians, that we do it inductively.
I think that's a really powerful kind of statement. I think about when people who are fairly new to faith, where they come to faith as kind of more as adults in that way. One of the things that has become a real consistent theme in my experiences, I've seen people come to faith is, well, what do I need to know? What do I need to do? How do I need to behave? And it's as if they're looking for almost like a software download where all of a sudden they now know and understand and experience everything, and then they get to live in this kind of perfect Christian kind of way and the likes.
100%.
Where one of the challenges is, even in discipleship, as we think about it in the life of our churches, is to be saying to people that this is a lifelong journey, that as we engage with absolute truth in the scriptures and as we continue to live out of these teachings of Jesus and what the Spirit of God is calling us into in our behaviours and patterns, that as we engage in the world, there's going to be some rubbing, there's going to be some challenges, there's going to be some tripping and some falling. And I love that analogy that you have around we need to crawl before we can walk and walk before we run, and we want to run, and a kid wants to run, but if they can barely walk, they're going to keep tripping and falling. And I think for me, as I think about discipleship, Nick, in particular, I often think about it as we're on this journey together where everyone's got grazed knees, right? And this becomes really important in the way that we live, because how we then engage in the world around us, particularly around evangelism and the way we think about discipling other people, we need to be really careful and mindful that we're leaving space for the Holy Spirit to work and to be leading and growing people, right?
Yeah, and I guess that's, you said absolute truth. Simon, you mentioned this idea of scaffolding. The truth of the matter is, if we look at the church on the whole, there's a variety of ideas around what that scaffolding may look like, what's necessary, what's not. So what does that look like? I mean, as we were preparing for this, Nath, you mentioned something around objective truth, and how that filters into the process of discovery, and some inherent possible dangers around that. So what does objective truth look like as we pursue and discover a worldview around Christianity? Because isn't that some sort of imposition?
Yep. I want to affirm that objective truth is a thing. So I'm not a relativist in the slightest. And I want people to know the truth, because I think there is a truth, and Jesus says he is the truth, and that's who we want people to know. But there's also, truth about the world that is objective and is absolutely true. Here's the problem, and here's the complicating factor, is that as sinful and broken human beings affected by the fall, how we apprehend truth is complicated.
Yeah,
it's complicated by the noetic effects of sin, that is the effects of sin on our minds and on the way that we think. It's also and on the way that we reason, more specifically. It's also affected, though, simply by the fact that as human beings we can't see reality completely clearly, and that's not a sin issue. That's just a creaturely issue. So we don't have a God's eye perspective of things. So God has the perfect, absolute truth version of everything. We will never have that, not even when we're with him in eternity will we have that, because we're different to him. But it's definitely the case that we don't have that now. So this is the complicating factor, and I think that this is gesturing towards what you were talking about, when we need to allow for a level of confusion even in people's understandings of the world, but also a bit of variance, a bit of complexity to that. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't push people toward knowing the truth. Absolutely, we should. But I think we have to be humble as people who are disciples, and as people who are making disciples. We have to be humbled by the fact that we don't actually have it all sorted out either. And so this gives us, I think, an appropriate humility. But the good news is that, of course, God has given us his special revelation both in Christ and in the scriptures, where we can see some things quite clearly. And so that's a huge help. And there are things that we can know about creation and about nature and see those things very clearly as well. But, the world is really complex. And if we were to think about something like ethics, so how do we live in the world? Some things are complicated, right? It's not actually always clear how people should behave in a particular situation or in a particular instance. In other situations, it is clear. we just have to allow, I think, for this kind of complexity and nuance. But it's not to suggest at all that there's relativism. I just think that's not true. I think that we just have to be patient with one another and patient with ourselves as we learn how to live wisely in the world.
Yeah, I think that whole idea of being patient and gracious with one another. Like I think about this constant picture that Paul in the New Testament keeps pointing of, this bear with one another, bear with one
Right.
another, bear with one another, as the eyes of our hearts are more enlivened, we can see and experience more and understand more. But there is this bearing with one another in community that is important. Mate, I'm really interested from more of a church kind of 1,000-foot level,
Mm.
right? So
Yeah.
Historically, I think it is fair to say that the church has been really good at enforcing kind of rules and perspectives and utilising kind of power and authority in those spaces, not always in a healthy manner. But
Well, that's an understatement.
that is a gross understatement. You're right, Nick. Thanks. Thanks. I'm trying to be really delicate here. But as churches, if we're going to give room for people to experience and grow, it's going to get messy. And what do you think that's going to look like practically? Like, you're a historian in terms of church, and the likes. As you see it, where have we not gone so well in the past?
Okay. Well, you're asking in terms of making new disciples, or are you just so I can frame the answer
so
properly?
I guess both new disciples and just this ongoing process of discipleship with people in the life of a congregation.
Yeah. Great. No, that's really helpful. Okay, so let me answer the question, I guess, by thinking particularly about the church, say, in the last 100 years in the West. One of the things that's happened that hasn't gone very well is I think that there's been I think generally, if you take things more broadly, there's probably been a decline of the importance of doctrine. Doctrine, I think, is a foundational for giving people confidence to move into the world and live and work things out. I think if we give people a solid doctrinal foundation, then that is a way of releasing people to then go out into the rest of life armed with something, something that they can interact with the rest of life with. But I think often churches these days in the West, particularly, are hesitant to be clear about something like doctrine for various reasons. It's complicated as to why that is. One of the things that I talk about in the book is that it'd be really good, I think, for schools and for churches to bring back catechesis, and that is training people in doctrine and training people in Bible really clearly. Now, obviously, preaching is really helpful for that. So if you're in a good church that has good preaching, you're going to be getting a fair bit of that. But I think that would be a really good way of both education institutions and churches sort of getting people on track in this regard. It just gives people a basic foundation for the rest of their life and for their understanding of who Christ is and how they relate to him. So I guess that's one answer to the question. Another one would be, I think this is probably more of a pastoral thing rather than a kind of intellectual thing. But to me, it seems really important that people have close connections with other people. That seems really obvious, but I think that's going to be happening less and less as we get more and more digital, as the age in which we live becomes more and more focused on artificial intelligence, and we're more obsessed with our devices, and we're more and more obsessed with, things that are novel, not technologically novel. The church, I think, in the past had probably been better at that because I think there was probably more organic community in general, and the church was part of that community. But now I think that's becoming more and more, people are becoming more and more disconnected, and so there probably needs. I think the last, say, few decades have seen a greater sense of disconnectedness with people in churches overall. And I think a really significant way in which the church can stand out from the rest of society is to be a place of real human connection. And it's with real human connection that people will grow and learn and become more like Christ. So they strike me as two ways in which churches can equip themselves to have a bigger impact on people's lives.
Mm.
I guess I'm interested in how you speak about doctrine as a device or as a tool in which we can allow people to have a good foundation, a good bedrock upon which they can build the rest of their life. How does that work, sort of holding it in tension with this idea that you also are in the process of discovering the worldview? Like, so you've got doctrine as bedrock, but you've also got discovery of that very doctrine that is your bedrock, and so there's a tension.
There's a tension. I think that tension is a really difficult one.
Yeah.
And so, Simon, how do we marry that tension?
Yeah, good. I'm glad you asked, because I recognise that I'm introducing attention here. So on the one hand, I'm saying we have to let people grow and be, interact with a complex world. But on the other hand, I'm saying we actually want to be dogmatic, right? In the good sense of the word. We want to have something solid that people can hold on to. I think since the early church, you just have to look back through church history. Churches have always, until relatively recently, as I suggested before, have always had a doctrinal or dogmatic basis upon which they operated. So to me, that's just a bedrock foundation that people can grow from. It's not to suggest that we don't have any deductive we don't have any deductive categories. I don't want to abandon that entirely.
Okay.
But I think that Christian doctrine is a basic for churches, has been historically, always should be, and hopefully, and God willing, always will be. So I think if you don't have a doctrinal foundation, you sort of lose you lose a firm ground upon which people can go and explore, if that makes sense. So how do you marry these two things? Well, I think as churches we can have we should have confidence in teaching doctrine, and I think we should do it in Sunday schools with kids and with adults. We should have some doctrinal teaching, in Bible studies potentially as well, and make this really clear, because it's unambiguous. It strikes me that even though churches can disagree, and as a Presbyterian, I would disagree with Baptists on some core issues around what the church is and the sacraments and so on, right? So we can recognise those differences, but I think at least the churches can identify who they are and teach their people clearly what they think about those things. That can really help people have a foundation upon which to explore the world.
So sort of just from an imagery perspective, looking at it like fences around an open garden, where exploration in the open garden stops at the fence, which would be the doctrine that we hold to as a church, something like that.
I think that's good, and I think something like that makes sense. One of the images I use in the book, actually, and this isn't necessarily so much to do with doctrine, but it's to do with this idea of worldview, is that I say, okay, what effectively what we're doing when we're talking about people growing in wisdom and gaining a Christian worldview is the image I use is that of a mosaic, a beautiful mosaic on the roof of the ceiling of a church. So you think about one of those beautiful ancient churches in Europe, or in the Middle East, which have these gorgeous, complex mosaics. They're all made up of, hundreds or thousands of tiles, pottery tiles. And the finished mosaic is the Christian worldview. It's the true understanding of reality. The only person who has the full picture is God. And then we're all working together on putting together this mosaic, right? This Christian worldview mosaic. Now, you can think about it in individualistic terms. We all have a mosaic we're building, I don't know. Or you could think about it in corporate terms. We're all working on the same mosaic. I'm not exactly sure how, people want to think about that. But I think of the master plan. Doctrine is sort of part of the master plan. So there are markings on the ceiling that help us know where to put tiles, right? There are boundaries. There are fences around the field that we play within. And so, I think that's what the image you've used there is helpful, but so is potentially the idea of a mosaic, and there being a master craftsman who's given us, God's given us things to believe and to hold on to that can help us with the rest of life.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah, both are really wonderful images, and I just think you look fantastic.
Thank you.
Tiptoeing ththrough the roses.
Thank
Yeah, just make sure.
I don't know if I tiptoe anywhere, but okay,
Yeah,
cool.
but just remember there's a fence. Hey, I want to kind of turn it a little bit in terms of the way we then as Christians engage with the world and around us, and inevitably. We do discover a Christian worldview. There is a Christian worldview, and we want the world to know the majesty and the lordship of Jesus. We want them to know the beauty of the kingdom of God and the fullness and the likes. Again, I want to ask you probably the first question is has the church in Australia done a very good job historically on engaging the world around us, allowing others to discover Jesus? And then secondarily, how do we best do that? How do we allow the space for people to discover Jesus and the beauty and the majesty in which he beholds, and the hope that is the coming of the fullness of the kingdom of God?
Okay, yeah, good. So I would think about people encountering Jesus as different to growing in wisdom toward a Christian worldview. I think encountering Christ is not so much. You might feel like you've discovered Christ, right? So someone that might be their testimony. They might say, "I gradually discovered Christ." I've got a friend who's a historian, actually an academic in Sydney, whose journey is more like that. Like that she gradually discovered Jesus Christ. But at the same time, anyone who encounters Christ, it's a cataclysmic moment, right? And it's something where someone's life is turned around and changed. And so even if you have a gradual discovery, it's still like that. So the basic job of the church, in my view, is to preach the word and administer the sacraments, and to do that faithfully. At the same time, then there's the job of discipleship inside the church and outreach to those outside the church. Just 1 second, it's raining a lot outside. I've got to close the window. And it's just all of a sudden bucketing. So I suppose that it's tricky, isn't it? Because in a society that is often quite hostile to the gospel and doesn't really want to hear what we have to say a lot of the time, it sounds like when you're preaching and evangelizing, it feels like and sounds like everything's falling on deaf ears. No one's listening. I think we're turning a corner, interestingly, culturally. A few years ago, just to use Aaron Wren's framework, we were in negative world and Stephen McAlpine writes about this, right? Where we're the bad guys, and so we're in a culture where it's not neutral anymore. Like we are seen as enemies of the wider culture. I think things are turning a corner, interestingly. There's a little bit of an uptick in church attendance in England. There are celebrities coming to know Jesus, and they're being public about it. There's an interesting thing happening where people are actually discovering Christ. And I trust that the reason for that isn't simply a sort of obscure and strange miraculous work of the Spirit outside of the work of the church, but actually just faithful churches doing faithful things are then ready to receive them. We're ready to receive these people who are looking for something more, because our world's really empty without Jesus. Like, it doesn't matter how many subscription services you have. It doesn't matter how much money you have in the bank account. It doesn't matter how many nice cars you have or how many bedrooms your house has. If you don't have Christ, you don't have much at all. And it does start to feel empty. And maybe people feel more and more empty the more they have, potentially, because they expect to feel like they've made it and then they don't. I just think churches need to be faithful at the basics. One of the things that has been probably disappointing the last few decades is that churches have been faithful at all the fancy stuff, being more and more like the world. I think we probably need to be less like the world and just do those basics really well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you said a lot there. I want to ask a question in light of sort of you saying historically there is this thing where the church has been the enemy of the wider or the more general community or the worldly community or whatever you want to phrase it as. Why is that? Is that rooted in some sort of just because they were faithful and so the community rejected them, or is there a bit more nuance around what that looks like? I guess.
I think particularly answering it from an Australian perspective.
I think from an Australian perspective, yeah.
Good. So I think that the change isn't so much that we haven't become the bad guys, to use Steve McAlpine's sort of wording. We haven't become the bad guys in Australia because we're so different to everyone else. I think the church has got on the nose in Australia because, there's probably a few reasons. One is that there's been a general decline in church attendance for about 5 or 6 decades. So since the 1960s, when you had a huge uptake in the number of people owning cars and a huge uptake in the number of people owning televisions, people used to go to church because that's what you did on Sunday. And so the culture was more amenable to Christianity before the 1960s in general because everyone was sort of involved in the church one way or another, and the church was more central to people's lives. It was more central to people's actual community life as well. Lots of things happened in and around the church. The local church was a hub of activity. And particularly in towns like where you guys are, the church played a significant, an even more significant role, you might say, in bringing a smaller community together, especially in country Australia. However, with the advent of mass production of cars and mass uptake of cars and then television, things changed and people started doing other things with their time. I think what you see there is probably maybe you could argue that just revealed where people's hearts already were. Potentially, they were already not really interested in what Jesus had to offer, and so this just gave them a way of doing something else with their time. Okay, so maybe that's true. Whether it is or not, or whether it actually turned people away from Christ, I think the process has been more gradual and just more broadly cultural, I would say, rather than there being a reaction against Christianity. In the last couple of decades, there has been more of a reaction against Christianity because our ethics as more conservative Christians have grated more openly with the ethics, particularly the sexual ethics of our wider culture. And I think that's brought more hostility. But up until then, I just think it was apathy. I think people were kind of apathetic and didn't really care either way. And once they become apathetic and they lose interest and they lose sympathy as well with the church. And then when the church becomes more, when the church starts to have views about things that are more at odds with the broader culture, then the lack of sympathy means that people become hostile. So that's how I would describe the process, particularly in Australia. And I would say people are generally apathetic to the gospel. And I wouldn't even say people are necessarily hostile. Where I live, I live in the Redlands, which is and just near the sea, near Brisbane. And, we have a lot of churches in the area and lots of Christians live here, but there's a lot of people, most people don't go to church still. I would say people just don't care. I don't think people are angry at Christianity or hostile to Christianity. And it might be similar where you guys are.
Yeah, I think I actually mentioned this on a sermon that I preached just recently, that I think people do have varying views on who Jesus is. But I think for the vast majority of Australia, it is just apathy. I just don't think they care. I don't. Right. So I don't think it's in that way. I do think though that that the church has failed in lots of different ways. And one of the things that you didn't touch on that I'm interested in that is that the abuse that has taken place and the power and authority that the church had and utilised. How much of a role do you think that that's had in speeding up potentially the decline maybe is rather than kind of causing it? And secondarily, what do we do then in terms of trying to, like, I know it's preaching the gospel and we've got to be faithful in those things, but what's a place then of Christians trying to then influence society on a more generalised basis, right, to kind of undermine some of those negative views and the like? So two parts to that question, I suppose.
Yeah, sure. So I guess to the first part of the question, the role of say, abuses of institutional power, I don't think that's played an overwhelming role in the reaction against the church.
Interesting.
Maybe in certain corners of the church, and I would put the Roman Catholic Church in this boat. I think that because of the way that the Roman Catholic Church worked, people who were Roman Catholic often went to Catholic schools, or they might have grown up staying Catholic orphanages even. And I know some people who are in that situation. And there were, significant abuses of power in those contexts, which we've all learnt about, and they're awful and really sad to hear. But the Catholic Church, as well as the Protestant churches who had similar issues, weren't special in that. There's been lots of abuse of power in state schools and in other institutions as well. So I think that the reaction that abuse of institutional power is a bad thing, and I think that the reaction against that, I think that's just, again, it's just been a way of people reacting against the church. It's given people a reason to react against the church, but I don't think it's necessarily the cause, by and large, of negativity towards Christianity. I think it's played a role, but not necessarily a really significant one. I think if historians look back on this era, I suspect they will say that the uncovering of institutional abuse, things like child abuse or financial abuse in churches, whatever it might be, that will have played a role, but I don't think it'll be the headline reason. I think there'll be those bigger cultural questions that will come up. And now you have to remind me of the second. Oh, yeah, the second part was about engaging the culture, and influencing the culture.
If I could just push, just in that space, I think it's interesting because when we're talking about Christian worldview and we talk about this disparity in the ethics of the world versus Christianity, do you not think maybe while institutional abuse was across the board in all sorts of different institutions, the church should and is held to a higher standard because it preaches a different, it upholds itself to a higher standard to just your normal state school or anything like that. So that maybe plays a role in, well, hold on, you guys are saying one thing, but you're doing something else here. What's going on?
For sure, hypocrisy is a massive turn-off. I completely agree.
Yeah,
Totally agree.
Yeah, and so I guess that leads me into the next point, right? So there is this sense of hypocrisy, and that is felt. I think that is fair to say that this hypocrisy is felt by the larger populace of Australia, and understandably, right, to a point. So I really appreciate you kind of acknowledging all of those things and then thinking about how that's played out. But what do we do now? What do we do? I mean, you've got different people with different views, right? So you've got certain pockets of the Christian community saying that we need to establish kind of Christians into politics so that we can, set up a Christian nation again. And you have all of these kind of varying. I know it's a bit of a straw man in that regard. I fully admit that. But I guess from a broad sweep, and then you've got people who, on the other end of that, who are afraid to engage and even to share necessarily that they are believers in Jesus in their workplace. So you have these two ends of the spectrum. Yeah. How do we now, as individuals and as a church, engage in culture?
I think one of the foundational things is something I mentioned earlier, which is we have to strengthen ourselves internally. So I think the church needs to grow a lot stronger at being a community of faith which builds, loves one another. Christ says if they look at you and they'll say that you love one another, they'll know that you are my followers if you love one another. And I feel like that's a really strong and powerful witness that the church maybe hasn't cultivated as much recently. So I think something like to use Rod Dreher's Benedict option as an example kind of framework. I think not necessarily withdrawing from community, but strengthening churches and Christian communities, I think would make sense as a foundation. At the same time, I teach at the Lachlan Macquarie Institute, and the Lachlan Macquarie Institute is a Christian leadership training institute out at Murray Bateman. And one of the main things that institute does is train people to go into politics and civil society roles where they have a cultural influence. Christians in particular. So there's not always Christians who go there and attend the course. And so I'm also passionate about seeing Christians go into those more influential spaces in society. And one of the reasons I became a scholar and an academic, and one of the reasons I love doing what I'm doing, is because I get to have my say on important issues, in public discourse. I get to publish and write. And I think that Christians should engage in those spaces, just like they should engage in politics and in other things as well. I think that we've seen we're coming into a time where it's going to be harder for Christians to be in those positions, and I think that will require, a work of God to sort of make the culture more amenable to Christianity. Christians can become more influential, but it doesn't rule out the possibility of Christians being influential. And I think we have a role as salt and light, and to use, Martin Luther's images of, vocation, like people who have the most mundane, we might think of them as mundane vocations, or we might think of them as really normal vocations, or, so you might just, be stacking supermarket shelves, or which is not, by the way, is a noble task, and I think it's one that's worth doing as a Christian. You might be a cobbler. Luther uses the idea of a cobbler or a milkmaid, doing God's work, whatever they're doing. That's all faithful service in God's sight. And so I think that Christians should strengthen themselves in their Christian communities and in their churches. They should have lots of kids. They should.
Well, you're really upholding that one, mate.
They will be fruitful and multiply. But they should. I mean, they should have lots of kids because I think that we're not that everyone has to have 5. That's not what I mean. But I just think it makes a lot of sense to do that, and I think that it's God's natural plan to grow the church. But it also means that there's just you're thinking generationally. You're thinking about, okay, what's the next generation of Christians going to be like? How many of us are there going to be? There should be as many as possible, right? That's how the church works. And I think that this is foundational stuff, but I think we still want to look to put people into significant positions of influence if we can. But I think that's going to be hard for a little while. And so I don't think we can, avoid that reality.
So let me tell you then, and you write pretty heavily into this space. What does that mean in terms of education, right? So we want to see more Christians engaging in public spaces. What do we do with institutions and organisations that have a bit more of a separatist kind of model? What do we do with that?
I think the separatist model is not a bad model, strategically speaking, at this time. I think that we've been through a period where Christian institutions have been more mainstream. So if you were to look at the way that the church was viewed up until, say, the 1980s. The Bishop of Sydney, the Archbishop of the Sydney Anglican Diocese, was seen as someone who had public respect. And so if he said something, people listened. It's the same with the Catholic bishops. And Christian schools, church schools, were seen as a significant influence. That's changing. And the reality is that I think Christians need to think about building their own institutions, not necessarily exiting all the other institutions. I don't mean Christians shouldn't go to public university or anything like that. I just mean that it would make sense as part of that strategic cultural move to build your own institutions, start schools, start homeschool co-ops, start classical schools. I would love for someone to start a Protestant liberal arts college, a little bit like Campion College in Sydney. I think all of that is fantastic, and I think that'll be a really good thing to do going forward. I think that involves Christians thinking hard, particularly wealthy Christians thinking hard about how they deploy their resources and their money. The reason why those institutions often start is because 1 or 2 rich people have a vision to support something and get something going. God can use that wealth really powerfully. So yeah, that's the kind of thing I would like to see start happening.
The other one too, and you hit at it a couple of times, that we need to be strengthening Christian community. We need to be strengthening Christian community. One of the hardest things we talk about this all the time. One of the hardest things as pastors, right, is to continue to foster community, because it seems like a lot of Christians, we love the term and we want to build more community, but what we're really saying is, as long as it looks the way that we want it to look, and you've scheduled the things that we want you to have scheduled. How do we strengthen Christian community? Because regardless in the case, one of the real factors that exists at the moment in the life of the church is this in and out approach. We're in for the things that we want and we're out when it doesn't suit us. But we're all pretty loud at saying we want community as long as it, doesn't cost us too much. How do we strengthen Christian community? And not from a pastoral perspective, because I think it starts with everyone. So what does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm really happy to kind of spitball some things that I've thought about. Yeah. So, one of the things I've noticed with the sense of church community is the importance of geography. So, in Victoria, I was part of a church that was in a town of about 10,000 people just outside of Geelong, and that church had an identity that was attached to that town. But if you're in a church in a massive city, like in Sydney or in Brisbane or wherever, and you're in some suburb which doesn't have really an identity, it has a name, but people don't identify with that geographic area so much. And so that can actually be a bit of a weakening point for churches who are in those kinds of geographic areas, like in big cities and suburbs and things like that. The church I attend here in Queensland is on the coast in a little coastal town. And the people who attend it all live within sort of 15 minutes of the church. And so that strengthens the natural and sort of organic nature of the church community. And we all live fairly close together. It's easy to pop around to each other's houses to do practical things with one another. It's easy to go fishing with my mate who lives 5 minutes away. It's easier to do that. My kids play with their kids. You know what I mean? Like, it's easier to do those things. One of the things that Christians could think about doing is just living closer to each other. If you're too spread out, it's just harder to be in each other's lives, and you don't need to see each other every night or anything weird like that. But you do, I think, want to be able to see each other just in normal life, not just on Sunday mornings and at Bible study. So that'd be a way, I think, of thinking about growing and in strengthening community. But another thing that I think is potentially a powerful stimulus for this is people just doing things together. So one of the churches I attended in the past, the blokes would often get together and do something practical. They'd all go and paint someone's house together, or they'd all work on the church playground together. You know what I mean? Like, they'd all get together and do things, and that is a really interesting, very normal thing to do, but very interesting in how it brings people together. We often don't think about that, but these are sort of simple, normal things to do. Live close to each other, do things together. And often it's the men that aren't that well connected, isn't it? And I think maybe we can think about how to strengthen the men in particular in that way, and that might help the women connect as well in the end. So there's some thoughts.
I think, look, maybe bringing it back to your point of expertise and just talking around this idea then of worldviews, the discovery of worldviews, the branching off as you discover of just seeing things slightly differently from the person sitting next to you or whatever. Not you, Nath, but just no. I guess one of the things around community is just fostering unity, even in our diversity and the way we see the world and the way we interact with the world. And I think it's interesting because currently the wider community within the world sort of have this in and out mentality, this polarized mentality. If you don't see it exactly the way that I see it, you're not a part of me. You're not one of us. Vice versa, right? And so
tribalism.
Yeah, and it's a weird thing. And so the church is called to unity, called to love one another. But also we run the risk as we pursue this process of discovery that we do see the world differently. We do interact differently.
Right.
So how within a local body, understanding that each person is sovereign in their own right, how within a local body do we strive towards unity within that community? I'm rhyming so much, man. It's so good.
Beautiful.
It should have been a rapper. Except with a South African accent, no one could understand you.
Okay, thank you. At least Simon understands.
I understood the question. I think this is where we come back to this doctrine thing. So doctrine is something that isn't something that depends on race or politics or geography or anything, right? Like, it doesn't matter where you were born or anything like that. If something is true, and the church teaches that as true about who God is, and about the church, that stands, and that is the point of unity, right? Christ is the fundamental point of unity, but then you can have this sort of doctrinal basis, which doesn't appear to have anything to do with community in one sense, does it? It's not connected to it. We don't necessarily have a doctrine of community, but it actually provides an anchor point for all of these diverse people to come together and gather around and learn to live together, which is not easy. I mean, I made a joke before about not seeing each other every day. The reason why we don't want to do that is because it's a bit hard to see your friends every day. Like, that's a bit tricky. Gets a bit much, and that's reality. Like, that is life. If you're always in each other's lives or sharing a house or something, it's hard. But we don't have to do that. Some people might, but we don't have to. The unifying point, though, is, I think, what our confession is. Like, what do we confess about Christ and about how we approach Him in worship, and about how we relate to each other? That seems to be, I think, a nice point of unity, despite all that diversity that you're referring to.
And you're specifically, from a doctrine perspective, referring to primary and secondary spaces, like primary issues and secondary issues, and so allowing secondary issues to sort of be issues maybe that we differ on, but not necessarily issues that matter in the way that we come together and interact with each other.
Yeah, I reckon that's right. I mean, I think that if you started to go too hard on something like eschatology, for example, that strikes me as a tertiary issue in terms of thinking about church unity.
Yeah.
That's just an example. Yeah, there are lots and lots of other examples you could pull out. But that'd be one which would be sort of outside the bounds of that. You could have interesting conversations about eschatology. People do all the time, right? But it's a fun topic. But it's not something that we have to divide. I don't think we should divide over that necessarily. So absolutely thinking about those primary issues and then secondary issues. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Cool.
Simon, you sound more like a Baptist than you realise, brother. That's quite phenomenal. That individual autonomy on secondary issues is a beautiful
that division
point.
We were talking about, mate. Well done.
Great. Hey, Simon, thanks so much for your time, mate. It's been a fascinating time getting to know you and getting to hear your perspectives. I really value the time that you've given up from your 5 kids. You really are kind of, carrying the banner on that one, mate. So, but no, thanks again. Seriously, thanks for your time. Thanks for your work in the spaces in which God has you. Really appreciate it, mate. We hope we get to have another conversation with you sometime down the line.
That'd be great, and I really appreciate having a chat to you both, Nathan and Nick. It's been fun.
Awesome. Thanks, bro.
Thanks, mate. Take care. Whoa, how was that?
Yeah, it was interesting. It was good. I'm grateful for his time. I think I'm grateful that he's allowed us to talk about these things that I think for some maybe airy-fairy and up here, and they're like, how do we... But sometimes it's these things that need to be spoken about that help us begin to start to formulate some of the ways we go forward.
In terms of practical living.
In the practical ways that we live.
Living in the balancing act of living in the world, not being of the world.
Exactly.
Let's explore that. I really appreciated Simon's perspective on worldview. So I think it's probably really in part, if people are still listening to the podcast, like at this point, I think it's good to kind of unpack that just
I don't know
a
what
little
you say.
bit. Well,
Yeah. So if you're still with us, we do love you.
Yeah. Thank you. Hi, Mum. Thanks for sticking it out again. I think in part, I really appreciated his perspectives that there is a nuance, right, in the way that we understand and live out of this Christian perspective in the world around us. So I think it's important for us to kind of identify that a Christian worldview is a way in which we discover how we live with and engage with Jesus, both internally within the life of a community and in the world around us.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We do want to experience the world through the truth of the scriptures, and there's going to be a jarring effect that takes place in that space. But I do think his take in terms of pushing us to the fact that worldview is not something that can just be imported. It can't be downloaded.
Yeah.
And now we just see the world in a particular way. I think it is helpful for us to say that once we know that Christ is Lord, this beginnings of seeing him as Lord over all means that we're going to need wisdom and engagement as we live out our lives day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, tripping and falling in our own mess and having to go up against the world around us.
Yeah, I think like when he was talking about that, I was just thinking there was a time I preached around like this great thing at 19 coming into seminary and 3 years later having all this great knowledge, but the knowledge not translating into practical life. Like there was this disconnect between my head and my heart, and realizing it in those moments, well, not in those immediate moments, but now at least, sitting and reflecting on moments like that, going, for those that are going, oh, just give me a course on what's Christian foundations and then I'll be good. Like, it's like, no, you won't.
No, you won't. And it's the same thing. So here's the true thing. I ran, like we've spoken about this. We ran discipleship material, right? Like I wrote a great course in terms of discipleship.
If you might say so yourself.
Well, it was what other people were saying. I didn't think it was that great individual, but thanks, man. Thanks.
No, you took a couple of shots. I'm coming back.
And fair play. But we wrote the course, and in the end, there were some stuff that we could see in people's lives that were changing, but you can't just take it on and go, oh, well, now it is, And I think it's the same way, even as we think about kids ministry, you can't just dump your kids into kids ministry and feel like they're going to get everything that they need to get and now they're going to be perfect little Christian boys and girls, right?
Yes.
That there is a process of discovery, that there is this process of sanctification, as he talks about, which is this place in which there's this change by the work of the Spirit in our lives to live more in accordance with Jesus himself.
Yes.
Right. And I think it's important, and his statements around that is this inductive. It's experiencing these things is so important.
Yeah.
So important.
No, I agree with you. And I think I love this idea of discovery. I love this idea of going, hey, like the guy that I'm walking with doesn't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers, but we're figuring it out in pursuit of Jesus.
Yeah.
And yes, I think there are inherent risks in that. Like one of the things he mentioned was this idea around doctrine as the bedrock. And to be honest with you, I'm not necessarily sure I agree in that space. And maybe you and I would disagree in this. Like, I think there are certain doctrines that are absolutely foundational, right? Like, but in what way does that undermine discovery when we've sort of injected doctrine already into the framework of the discovery, right? I feel like we need to trust the Holy Spirit more. This was part of the conversation that was maybe missing in how I know you alluded to it a little bit, but there should be a trust that he is the author of the space, of these individuals and their sanctification. No matter what we say, the actual transformative work comes by him.
Yeah, and
right?
him alone. I think, and just for our own benefit and for the benefit of those who are listening, you're not against doctrine.
No.
So you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And it's in that I agree with you that there are core beliefs that can never be shifted.
Absolutely.
Right? There are core beliefs that are absolutely foundational. How we teach
that's what I'm talking about.
Is really important.
Yep.
And I don't think that can be done in a course.
Yes. That's the point. That's what I'm trying to say.
I think that is done in community. I think that is done as we engage with the scriptures and we're honing this out. I think it is the responsibility of us as pastors to be preaching and to explaining key doctrines as they emerge from the scriptures of the text in which we are preaching and teaching on. I do still think there is a place for running courses around systematic theology. I think that they're really valuable, but even the way in which those courses are run must be discovery orientated rather than
Yes.
just simply going, this is what we believe.
It's a supplement to discipleship,
Yeah,
right?
it's a part of discipleship.
It's not this process where you like remove discipleship and now this guy knows because he's passed this particular level in this course or whatever.
That's right. We're not getting a certificate of completion and then going, well, now you're released into the
Now you can become an elder.
Yeah, I think that's some of these challenges in that space. And you know, sometimes the richest theology comes from those who are not particularly learned, but have lived this faithful walk with
Yes.
Jesus. So there was this woman, right? When Karen and I were at college, we were a part of a little small church that was met on campus. And we backed onto a nursing home and a retirement village, right? And we had this life group that was just rich. So we didn't want a particular demographic. We wanted it mixed generational. We wanted it to be beautiful. Anyway, so I would walk over on a Thursday and knock on the door and pick this lady up, and we would walk through the nursing home and through the retirement village and into our house. And then, you know, it was dark, and so I'd walk her home. She didn't finish school. She worked hard all of her life. She had a colourful life, a rich life that was challenging in lots of ways. But the most profound theology came from her in the sense that when we were talking around and we had different people and different struggles, and she would just look at someone who was going through the greatest of pain and just go, in all of this, Jesus is in control and he loves you. And you're like, yeah. And then other things simply is like, hey, I remember one in particular we were talking about, and this person was really struggling with some sin in their life. And she just looked and she said, Jesus died for you. Don't keep crucifying yourself. Seek him and let him change you. And I was like, mate, you don't need to write three volumes of a great big theological textbook to get hold of that. So sometimes this discovery, and her theology was shaped in preaching and teaching as she heard it, but it came out of her own wrestle.
Yeah.
There's something profound in that.
Yeah, and I think there's something profound in the fact that it takes a community as well. So there's this element where, we will have young people, young Christians walking into the church doors, but they're interacting with people that have walked for the last 30 years, the last 5 years, the last 15 years, and really just finding this amalgamation of people gathering together and just pouring into each other, right?
And that, I think, and I'm assuming, you know, I don't want to put words in Simon's mouth, but I'm assuming that that's what he's getting at. But when I was asking around this question of what does this look like in community? How do we formulate community? It's that I think is the key. It's not another program. It's not another event that's taking place. Although I do think he's right that men do happen to find connection, in particular in doing an event, something tangible together.
Yeah.
But I think it's what you just said then. It's this multi-generational community that is coming together, that is investing into one another, that I think we're missing.
But I want to say it's not just intergenerational from an age perspective, but I think people that have been Christians who are maybe Christians for the last 10 years but 35, and there's another older guy who's 45 or 50 walking into the church not knowing Jesus.
Lord.
There's an interaction that takes place there, right? Like
that's what so that's the intergenerational, the generation of following Jesus in that sense.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's the thing, we've got to allow the young people to speak.
Yes.
As much as we need anyone else to speak. I think that's really powerful. You know, one of the things I found really challenging from Simon's perspective is this whole engagement thing in the world. Because I do think this discovering of worldview is really important, even in the way that we do evangelism and mission in the world, right?
Yes.
Is allowing people, rather than trying to import lenses upon them as if trying to win them to your team, rather allowing them to discover the beauty and the majesty of Jesus, getting them to understand the freedom of his salvation
Yes.
and the joy. And I thought I agreed with half of his statement, but I thought it was strange in where he went in the end. This is what I mean. So when I asked him, how does the church engage, in politics and other bits and pieces, he talked about, we need faithful Christians who love Jesus in those public spaces to be a part of the discourse, right? We need, people in political spaces that can have influence in the community for good things, not just Christian things, but for good things. And we need people who are stacking shelves, and that's a noble task, he said, and I fundamentally agree. I then asked him around, what does that look like for education and for teachers and the likes. And I mentioned this kind of separatist move. What I meant by that is the kind of Christian schooling and the like, so the kind of separating out of the public school system and out of those different spaces. And I was kind of shocked then for him to say, oh no, we need, having Christian schools and setting them up, we need more of them at this time. I thought that was an odd thing. Because
why did you think that?
Well, I think fundamentally for the same reasons why what he's saying, we need Christians in politics and we need Christians in normal workspaces so that they can be an influence and they can be this place in which people discover more of who Jesus is. But I do think education is so primary in terms of the way that people engage and the likes. And so, one of the concerns I have is if we're not seeing Christian brothers and sisters going into schools and living out kind of Christianity in bold kind of ways and loving and gracious ways and showing value to the kids and the value of education, then where are we in that space?
Is it?
It feels odd to me.
Yeah. So just so maybe that I understand, but is it this perspective that you go into the world, live in the world, but their primary space of sort of figuring that out has become so isolated that everybody thinks like them, acts like them, talks like them, that when they go into the world, they kind of ineffective? Is there an element to that that's...
So, look, I mean...
Is that what you...
I can only I can only look at it from my own experiences of being a pastor. And I've been a pastor now for 15 odd years, right?
Sure.
So full time. But one of the things is we want to be teaching. So the heart of discipleship is to teach people to be in the world, but not be of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
We need to be doing that from a really young age. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a place for Christian education. I think there is. But I don't think that's the total solution. I think in the end, what we're trying to do is to help equip some of our children to engage with the world. And if we teach them in an isolated kind of pocket and we're trying to enforce a Christian worldview upon them and that's what's shaping them, what does that look like when they finish school and start engaging in the world and going to secular universities and going into secular workspaces and how can they manage? What does that look like? But at the same time, on the other space is kids right across the board. They are the next generation of leaders. They are the next generation of workers. And so teachers have this incredible place on being able to equip and to encourage and to show love and kindness in those spaces. We need Christian teachers in the public system for that benefit too.
Yeah.
And now I'm sure Simon's, I almost guarantee that Simon's not advocating that there isn't Christians in those spaces. But I just thought the way he answered it just caught me a little off guard.
Yeah, I guess... Look, I think from my own personal experience being in a Christian school for the first 7 years of my education and then going into a public school space, I was fundamentally unprepared for the shift between those two spaces, where I became a little rat from year 8 to year 12. I was just like this nuisance within the school. Um, and there was a massive wrestle with figuring out. I called myself a Christian, but every action was not necessarily Christian.
Mm.
And I think I think I agree with you, and I'm not. This is maybe not even what Simon was saying, but when we do create enclosed communities, little echo chambers that are Christian communities, that the values and the foundations are good and right, we also training our kids. We're not training our kids to interact with people that rub us up the wrong way, that may influence us down the wrong kinds of lines. And so you see this move right up until sort of year 12, where kids can stay in Christian schools and then leave and fall apart fundamentally, because the world has become such an enticing place for the way they think about it. And I think there is something in that says to me that we could be fooling ourselves going, no, we need to train people in Christian societies and in Christian communities solely, and then send them off to be politicians and teachers. And it's like, are they actually going to be effective in those environments and in those spaces?
Or how compromised do they find themselves? And so, and this becomes
the balancing act.
Balancing act, right? And I think this is the challenge. And I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I think we need to be really careful that we're thinking through this wisely as best we can. And I think we're going to find it different, and each person's going to think about this in a different way, right?
Yes.
And even with that, there was so much of what Simon was saying that I agreed with, but there was parts that I think I disagree with, and that I was challenged, and that's good, right?
It is good.
That's good. And so, I think that's trying to work it out. This is trying to figure this stuff out as we go. One of the things that I found really challenging, even in that regard, is, and I needed to push back on it a little bit, with the decline of Christianity. I really appreciated what Simon was saying. I think he's right that the emergence of cars and televisions,
it's more nuanced than we thought.
There is a nuancing that was kind of moving people away from cultural Christianity. But I do think that far more than probably what Simon's perspective is, I actually do think that the hypocrisy of the church and the abuse that has taken place in the church has fundamentally undermined our doctrine that Jesus is a loving, gracious, caring God. And I think that is really important for us to actually work our way through.
Yeah.
And particularly in the life of the church in Australia. I don't want to talk about the church in the West in that regard, because I think we need to own what we need to own from an Australian perspective.
Yes.
And I think he's right that is the Roman Catholic Church, but I also think it is Protestant churches too. And I really appreciated you putting back and saying, but I understand that this has happened in other institutions. But we as a church need to be held to a higher regard than that.
Yes.
And rightly so, because of the very doctrines we believe.
Yes, I think that's the thing, right? The church becomes culpable, and it's not this, but other people were doing it. That seems strange to me. It's more this going, no, we spoke and preached a very specific thing of love and grace and wholeness when you come into this place.
And safety.
So when you come here with all your brokenness and all your mess, Christ, through this community, is going to seek to make you whole and safe and bring you into who he is, in the fullness of who he is. And we're the very beings that undermine that. It's like, blah, 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 there's something there that does not sit well in my own spirit, makes me go, oh, Rick, that's terrible. That is absolutely terrible.
And I think, and this only plays out even more then in terms of the way that we need to, as Christians, not just the church, but as individual disciples and as community of disciples, the way in which we engage in the world.
Absolutely.
And so a part of that is we've kind of got to take our medicine a little bit. And I think taking ourselves away from community in that space so that we can feel safe. I'm not sure that's the way.
It's almost not wanting to look at the mess you've made, kind of a thing.
Yeah, and maybe that's a bit overplaying it, but certainly a significant part of the mess that has been created from the life of the church, right?
100%.
And so, like, a part of that is we find ourselves in a society that is skeptical, and sure, there might be some upturns and there might be some stuff, and I really hope that the Spirit of God is doing some really significant things in the life of the Australian community, and we'll come to know who Jesus is more and more. But again, I don't think that that's going to happen because we're sitting in a separate community, making sure that we're teaching doctrine every week. I think a part of that is equipping and training one another. I think it's discovering more of who Jesus is. It's discovering the truths of what we believe as followers of Jesus, and engaging meaningfully in the world around us.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Taking on the mantle of the Lord Jesus, and then representing Jesus. Like,
well, that's 2 Corinthians 5, isn't it?
Not the church, not your doctrine.
Yeah, not your church.
Just be Jesus.
Like, and that's the thing, 2 Corinthians 5, that we're ambassadors of Christ.
As if God was making
his appeal through us. And I think, I think about it, there was a great missiologist by the name of Leslie Newbegin, who has had profound impact on me, and his whole thing of releasing Christians, faithful brothers and sisters, into the varying spaces of society right the way through, and seeing people discipled from the bootstraps up, right? Like, this isn't an imposed thing from the hierarchy of the church, but rather seeing this kind of the church raised from its bootlaces. And I think that only happens when we as a community take Jesus seriously, and we us as individuals take Jesus seriously. And so I think my heart of discipleship, although fundamentally in agreement with Simon, we want to see Jesus magnified, but I'm not sure fully of
the how,
if I'm in full agreement with the how with Simon on that one.
But I want to just go back to something he said, which I think is so important, because we spoke about this idea that discovery will lead us down different paths, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But being gracious and humble as we consider other people, as we consider our own space, recognizing we see the world in broken ways. And so like, the answers that we have are not answers necessarily that work for everybody. And when you said it, right, you said, like, everybody's going to think about this differently. And specifically around the schooling thing, the truth of the matter is that we, as long as we are gracious to one another, no matter what decisions we come to ultimately along schooling or the way you want to engage,
whether you think drinking is good or bad, or whether you think about whatever,
like whether your discipleship is program orientated or not, like whatever we fundamentally disagree with, we are gracious and humble enough with one another to go, hey, man, you're a brother, you're a sister, I love you. That's the thing with that I think I want to land on with Simon, right, is there were some things that may not necessarily have lined up with the way I see things playing out personally, but the fact that he gave us the time,
it was awesome. And he is one smart cookie, man.
He's really bright, man.
And I really look forward to having another conversation with him sometime down the line.
So that was great, and I really appreciated that.
And I really appreciated his perspectives.
It's good.
That was fun.
It was
fun. Hey, thanks again. I love doing the balancing act with you.
Yeah.
I'm going to point to the sign again.
Okay,
the
cool.
balancing act. The balancing act. Do you know? I think I'm going to do that forever.
Yeah, I see so.
Yeah.
I will stop commenting on that.
No, don't, because then I'll stop doing it.
Yep.
Hey, thanks, Andrew, for all your work behind the scenes, mate.
Great.
Really appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next episode.